You're watching Structure and the Clinic, taking an intersectional, multidisciplinary and transcultural approach to teaching medicine as a social science. So this talk is about race, migration and the media. In this video, I will be speaking on what the collision of the COVID-19 pandemic and also the Black Lives Matter movement can illuminate about the ways in which medicine is racialised. I hope to speak about the overt and the subtle ways in which this racialisation impacts patients and also us as healthcare professionals. But before we dive into that, I just wanted to preface this conversation with the fact that this webinar is not intended to be a lesson. 40 minutes or so is not a sufficient amount of time to cover the various relationships between race and migration and the media. Instead, this is an invitation to encounter a different way of thinking, perhaps, about the scenarios we come across so often in our clinical practice every day. So to explore how medicine is racialised, we will begin by laying some critical foundations about race and racialisation. By using migration as a lens, I hope to show that how race becomes constructed. The second part of the session will explore the ways in which these constructions about race are utilised in medicine by looking at two different scenarios. First, we'll have a look at the racialisation of mental illness and what are the ways in which our ideas about masculinity impact the ways in which we conceptualise mental illness. And secondly, by looking at COVID-19, we'll be asking, how does racialisation render certain people disposable or martyrs? So I hope it's pretty accurate to say that as medical students, I'm a medical student, and as doctors, we want to provide the best care for our patients. I hope that it's also pretty accurate to say that we want this care to be as equitable as possible. So because of this desire to help our patient, so often we say to them, you should improve the ways in which you engage with healthcare professionals. So, make sure you come to your appointments on time, or you should engage less in risky behaviour, you should eat less food, you should eat less salt, you should exercise more, you should be a better parent, you should be better at taking your insulin, and so on and so on and so on. This way of approaching the clinical scenario often emphasises their individual and their life choices. So ultimately what we're saying to our patients is that your body, so your biology, and what you do with your body, so the choices that you make, are yours, essentially. So essentially we're saying that they are wholly responsible for their health if we take it to the nth degree. And this could be quite a lot for patients, I would argue. A structured approach, however, on encountering the clinical scenario, instead acknowledges that there are so many factors within and outside the patient's body, and also within and outside the patient's reach, that influence how the patients present to us at our clinics, at A&E, at wherever we may find them. And the important thing is that these factors so often can be structural. So these building blocks, which is a really cheesy thing to use, but the building blocks that you see in the box are all different shapes and different sizes. These can represent our institutions, our policies, the markets, media, customs, laws, and even healthcare systems. So the different ways in which these can be arranged produce intersecting axes of health inequality that can be mapped out across race, culture, gender, sexual orientation, and class, amongst other identities. So by using race today, this session seeks to demonstrate the ways in which structural forces, so these building blocks, influence health.
Sorry. So yes, you will need to monitor that.
What? The blood pressure.
Oh. The higher the blood pressure, the bigger the knock-on effects on the kidneys, which are already at an elevated risk due to your being of Afro-Caribbean origin. Are there any new studies?
That was racial ignorance. I'm not Afro-Caribbean, I'm actually African. There's a unity and a distinction between those places, and as a London doctor, you should be aware of those things to avoid generalising people of colour and accidentally becoming a deeply problematic member of your profession.
I'm sorry, it's just the term used on the reports.
It's got something to do with the form you keep pointing to. Maybe tell the big boss of the pharmaceutical neuro whatnot to change the form. Who makes the form?
It makes
I just want them to tell me what they mean by Afro-Caribbean, given it's not where I'm from and it's used to describe my origin.
I don't know.
Is that the extent of your diagnosis? Hello, Arabella, you're Caribbean and I don't know.
So for me, filling out these forms is always an experience. So sometimes I'm Black British, sometimes I'm Black African, sometimes I'm Afro-Caribbean or African Caribbean, or sometimes I'm just Black. Although widely used as like analytical categories, racial classification systems, which oftentimes assumes biology as a basis for such categorizations, have been critiqued as unscientific and poorly defined. So Arabella, in the video that you'd watched, says that she is an African and not an Afro-Caribbean, and that these have specific meanings. There is a unity and a distinction between these two places. The ways in which we come to understand illness and therefore design our interventions are often separated by race. So medicine assumes that there are firm genetic bases behind these racial classification systems that tell us about who gets sick, why they get sick, and what we can do about their sickness. Yet our research and the guidelines that emerge from it demonstrate an incoherent understanding of race and racism and ethnicity. So like, why? Why is this? Simply put, there's no consensus around the meaning of race. So what we mean by race is not fixed by nature, but instead is dependent on the historical, social, and political context. So think back to those structural blocks that we mentioned before, those building blocks. So humans are not divided biologically into distinct continental types or racial genetic clusters. Instead, these racial categorizations emerge as a social phenomenon rather than a biological one. This distinction is really important because it forces us to reframe how we engage with these racial classification systems that we so frequently encounter, both in our research and in our clinical practice. So racial categories are not static. They come to be through multifaceted and ongoing structural processes. Racialization is a useful framework that helps us to see how these racial categories emerge. Racialization can be defined as the social and political process by which race becomes a salient element of social relationships. Racialization directs our attention to how groups not previously defined as races have come to be defined in this process and assesses the various factors involved in such processes. So by looking at migration, hopefully we can see how this process of racialization can occur. So you see here, the tabloid newspapers that we're so often bombarded with. And I'd like for you to think back to those forms again that Arabella was talking about. Think about the white category. So oftentimes there is a box for white other. Over time, the category of whiteness has expanded. The varying degrees of whiteness are constructed to produce and also to reinforce differential levels of desirability. Even people who are considered white, so think about Hungarian, Romanian and Polish people, for example, are othered through the migration process. So East European migration to the UK has been racialised in tabloid journalism. Like I mentioned before, have a look at the newspaper articles, titles on your screen. So there's repeated associations of East European migrants with crime, particularly the sensational variety, presents these migrants not as upstanding workers who are trying to make a living, as most people are doing, but as dangerous criminals and social parasites preying on the well-meaning hosts, so like the UK. So crime in this sense does not simply describe what these migrants do. Instead, it describes who they are and what they are. And here we see racialization. So the moral deficiencies of the criminal are indiscriminately ascribed to migrants as part of their innate character. Thus, these racial classification systems, if assumed to be biological, are erroneous. So instead, the Western concept of race that we use must be understood as a classification system that emerged from and is in support of white supremacy, European colonialism, of oppression, and of discrimination. So it does not have its roots in a biological basis. So race has become a social reality that orders societies and influences how we experience the world. In short, the ways in which race comes about is influenced by structural factors. These are the building blocks that I mentioned before. So hopefully you can see that the ways in which race is socially constructed. So what does this have to do with medicine? So the second part of this session will explore how these constructions are operationalised. So first, let's take a look at the racialisation of mental illness.
A bunch of young men, all dressed in black, dancing extremely aggressively on stage.
So we just listened to a video by Skepta, and the voice in the video says, "A bunch of young men, all dressed in black, dancing extremely aggressively on stage. It made me feel so intimidated, and it's just not what I expect to see on primetime TV." So who or what do you think of when I say aggressive? And who do you think the voice in the clip is? And can you relate to what the voice is saying? So the ways in which masculinities are constructed do not occur in a vacuum. They are shaped by all manner of things. So remember those structural factors that I keep going on about. So think of imperialism, think of books and film and adverts and housing and capitalism and just general interactions and music and so on and so on and so on. So the modern day mainstream use of masculinity here in the West, I would argue, typically speaks of men, of power, of dominance and aggression. Throughout modern history, the black man is seen as the epitome of these like violent constructions of masculinities. Again, I ask, so what does this have to do with mental illness? So as I said before, I'm a medical student at King's College London, so I'm mostly in like South London, that's where I practice. And I remember a friend telling me about a conversation she had with another medical student who had said that walking around Camberwell is like walking around a psychiatric unit. So I find this pretty curious. So I'd like to ask you, if you know Camberwell, what images do you think of when you think of Camberwell? So who lives in Camberwell? What do the people who live in Camberwell do? I wondered what it was about Camberwell as this medical student was, perceiving this thing, that made the medical student think about mental illness specifically. Perhaps it's the buildings, or the pubs, or the restaurants, or the markets. Maybe it's the Maudsley, which is a large psychiatric hospital. Perhaps it's the people of Camberwell, like what they look like, how they speak, how they move, what they wear, etc. What we do know is that 42% of the people in Camberwell are black. Does this have something to do with it? I don't know. What does this have? Would this medical student think of mental illness when they walked around, say, Whitechapel or Paddington or Chelsea? Whatever the reason, the statement shows that there's a relationship between the ways in which we think about people situated in a particular environment and a medical system that diagnoses mental illness. So in other words, the statement insinuated that there was something about the people or the buildings in Camberwell, so think of those structural factors I keep talking about, that signal mental illness to them. So given the density of ethnic minority people, we can postulate perhaps that race has something to do with it. And I would wonder, where do we see this connection between race and mental illness? So I would like to remind you of the definition of racialization again. So it is the social and political process by which race becomes a salient element of social relationships. So let's go back briefly to the 1960s in America. The American Psychiatric Association Committee on the Nomenclature and Statistics are in the process of revising the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. So that's the DSM. So the DSM-1 previously defined mental disorders as a series of reactions between individual personalities and external events. So schizophrenic reaction was constructed to be an emotional disharmony that manifested through unpredictable disturbances in stream of thought and regressive behaviour. That's how they named it. And at this time, the DSM-1 described schizophrenia and most other disorders in sort of like gender-neutral, like passive voices. So we can say that there was some flexibility about who could fit that particular diagnosis, say, of schizophrenic reaction. This changes as the socio-political situation intensifies in America. So Black Power became the rallying cry of many Black thought and political leaders during the Civil Rights Movement and as it progressed. So we see the emergence of the Black Panther Party in 1966, and it's in this climate that Pan-Africanists and African nationalists such as Malcolm X described a global African community connecting the native and diaspora Africans. So under these conditions, there emerges an anxiety about Blackness, specifically about masculinized Blackness, and this spills into schizophrenia diagnosis. DSM-2 emphasizes the patient's attitude, emphasizes that the patient's attitude is frequently hostile and aggressive, and that his behavior tends to be consistent with his delusions. So the image you can see on the left is one for a drug called haloperidol, and it says, corporations often begins with haldol. So evidence suggests that the doctors in the 1960s and 70s used this language to overdiagnose schizophrenia in African American men and to posit that Black forms of the illness were more hostile and aggressive than white ones. So you can see here that the image looks like James Brown. We've got the Black power fist there, and so the connotations that are being conjured up are very similar to what is happening in the socio-political context. And again, this person, this image is belligerent, So ever since researchers, the doctors in the 60s and 70s, so use this language of assaultive and belligerent and aggression, etc., to posit that Black forms of illness were more hostile and aggressive than white ones. So the Haldol ad that you see played on doctors' racial anxieties in order to promote antipsychotic medications as treatments for clinical and social pathologies. So this article, again around the time, was published in General Psychiatry in 1968. The authors Walter Broomberg and Frank Simon write, "The purpose of this paper is to identify a specific type of reactive psychosis relating in part to recent socio-political events." And they go on, and later they say that the particular symptomatology, so I'm reading from the highlighted yellow here, the particular symptomatology we have observed for which the form protest psychosis is suggested is influenced by social pressures, so the civil rights movement, dips into religious doctrines, the Black Muslim group, is guided in content by African subcultural ideologies, and is coloured by a denial of Caucasian values and hostility thereto. This protest psychosis amongst prisoners is virtually a repudiation of white civilization. So I hope you can see that that this article explicitly demonstrates how the socio-political moment racializes mental illness. I think it's pretty difficult to argue that these two can be divorced with what we're seeing here. So this racialization lays the groundwork for schizophrenia diagnosis, and its influence is stretching until today. Here today, in the UK, Black people have excess prevalence rates in psychosis compared to white majority population. We also know that Black Caribbean patients are significantly more likely to be compulsorily admitted to hospital compared with those white ethnic groups. We also know that Black Caribbean patients are also significantly more likely to be readmitted to hospital compared to white ethnic groups. So there's something about Blackness that increases these risks. As we have seen from the Skepta video, from the comments about Camberwell and the shift in schizophrenia diagnosis, structural factors, so that's the sociopolitical situation that is grounded in a particular historical moment, influence how we think about certain bodies, and how that shapes how we engage with them. So this was a paper that was published in 2019, and it says the most common explanation for the increased risk of detainment of BAME population included increased prevalence of psychosis, increased perceived risk of violence, increased police contact, absence of or mistrust of general practitioners. There's something harrowing for me about the risks that are highlighted in red, especially in this moment that we're in. There's an increased perceived risk of violence and increased police contact. And young Black men were stopped and searched by police more than 20,000 times here in London during the coronavirus lockdown. So that's the equivalent of more than a quarter of all Black 15 to 24-year-olds in the capital. And more than 80% of the 20+ thousand searches between March and May resulted in no further action. For some people, encounters such as these have fatal consequences. So on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black American man, was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, during an arrest for allegedly using a counterfeit note. Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, continued to kneel on Mr. Floyd's neck as he pleaded that he could not breathe for 9 minutes. This public lynching of a Black person at the hands of the police is just one of so many. Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Tony McDade, the list goes on. Often we think that such horrific things happen like over there in the US. Here in the UK, Roger Sylvester was detained under the Mental Health Act in January 1999. Roger was taken to an emergency psychiatric unit in Haringey in North London, where he stopped breathing after being held down on the floor by 6 police officers for 20 minutes. Sarah Reid, in 2016, was found dead in her Holloway prison cell, where she had been remanded in order to obtain 2 psychiatric reports. In August 2011, Mark Duggan was fatally shot by police officers in Tottenham. So this process of racialization that renders Black bodies as violent and therefore to be feared is not a matter that is outside of medicine. The murder of George Floyd, sparking widespread protests across the globe, the Black Lives Matter movement, or BLM, has collided with the COVID-19 pandemic. Public Health England reports that Black people are more likely to be diagnosed with COVID-19 and that the rates of death from disease is highest amongst Black and Asian people. So the collision of BLM and COVID-19 has laid bare the rampant structural inequalities in our society. In the same way that we have seen the structural factors influence the racialization of mental illness, we must look at the structural explanations that render particular people and Black people in the BLM movement and minority ethnic people in COVID-19 here in the UK more vulnerable. So coronavirus became a racialized disease from the moment it was first reported, and racism spiked against East Asians, or from the quick ways in which we used biological explanations, so vitamin D deficiency, to explain the disproportional figures of those catching and dying from COVID-19. So remember how we spoke about the ways in which biological underpinnings of race obscure the structural realities from which race emerges? There is limited evidence that being from an ethnic minority background should inherently leave you more or less vulnerable to coronavirus for biological reasons. For the case of COVID-19, we must also look at the structural factors and how this virus is racialized. There's a great article in Galdem that explores this, which you should have a look at. But I want you, if you are based in the UK, to think back to the middle of March. So here, lockdown was like just beginning, and maybe you were kind of like beginning to get into the routine, figuring out how to sort of like, make sense of the situation. So we've been told by the government to stay at home. So yeah, when you place an order, say, from Amazon, there was someone to deliver it. Maybe you couldn't be bothered or were not able to cook. So you go to your Deliveroo, order yourself some food. Somebody delivers it. Or perhaps you needed to use public transport to volunteer, say, at King's College Hospital as a healthcare assistant if you're a medic. Or perhaps as like lockdown eased, when you could see your loved ones from a distance, of course, you got into an Uber and went to see them. Perhaps you or your loved ones did get coronavirus and needed to go to the hospital. There you would encounter porters and cleaners and nurses and doctors and so on. So these people who previously would have been largely invisible have been made our key workers. The healthcare professionals, the care workers, the social workers, the bus drivers, the cleaners, the delivery drivers. As the pandemic has progressed, we have seen disproportionate rates amongst our key workers. It just so happens that our key workers are from Black and Asian and other migrant groups. If race has a biological basis, why is it that this group of people working in diverse jobs, coming from diverse backgrounds, are impacted by the pandemic in such a similar way? The reasons for these deaths and these illnesses are structural. These key workers are more likely to be exposed to the virus. They are more likely to be living in poverty, working in precarious, low-paid jobs, to be living in overcrowded accommodation and in food deserts. So to explain this vulnerability through a biological lens is to render these glaring structural factors absolutely obsolete. So furthermore, such structural factors making Black and brown people more vulnerable to disease have not appeared as COVID-19 appeared. They have existed for as long as systems that prefer certain bodies over others have existed. It's not new. It is this preference which provides the conditions that allow us to make Black and brown bodies expendable in explicit ways and in more subtle ways. There are many people of colour working in healthcare in this country, reflected by the reality that our first 4 doctors who died from the coronavirus outbreak were all Muslim immigrants with roots in Africa and South Asia. It is these staff members who feel that they are being put on COVID wards, for example, and being exposed to patients with COVID over and above other colleagues. It is these staff who lack the personal protective equipment and the testing that is leaving them feeling unsafe. It is these staff who are stuck when their employers refuse to give sick pay, when the government implore them to stay at home. In all of this, rather than addressing these racialized structural factors, we instead heroize our key workers, like our doctors and nurses and our carers. They are the front line whose deaths are attributed to martyrdom rather than to structural racism. I want to draw attention to the vastness of the structural violence that Black and brown bodies experience, and the difficulty of the situation that the collision of COVID-19 and the BLM protests that we saw. So at this time, we saw how COVID-19 was disproportionately affecting minority ethnic groups here in the UK. And we also saw the fatal results of violence at the hands of the police. So what did people do in this environment? They protested. We went out into the streets and made our voices as loud as they could be. What does it say about our society when the ways in which we can draw attention to and resist the violence that is killing Black people endangers our very lives? So people are putting their bodies on the line. To me, it says that in the eyes of those in power, we are disposable. Some of you may have seen the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston, who was a slave trader. And you can see it in the image there. So what does it say about our society when there is outrage over the disposing of this notorious slave trader? I don't know if you can remember the conversations that happen across like social media and other forms of media about people being angry that this was happening. So what does that say? To me, it says that in the eyes of those in power, we are disposable. And to highlight this difference in response, I'd like to draw your attention to these two different things. So these are two ways in which the government responded to the ways in which people were made disposable. So think about the statue and also individual lives that were lost to COVID-19, and then also those lives who are lost at the hands of the police. So on the left, Boris Johnson airs his fears about the disposal of other statues, and these sort of like anxieties cause the authorities to respond by protection. So I'm just going to read out his Twitter feed. He says, "The statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square is a permanent reminder of his character in saving this country, and the whole of Europe, from a fascist and racist tyranny. It is absurd and shameful that this national monument should today be at risk of attack by violent protesters. Yes, he sometimes expressed opinions that were and are unacceptable to us today, but he was a hero and he fully deserves his memorial. We cannot try to edit or censor our past. We cannot pretend to have a different history. The statues in our cities and towns were put there by previous generations." That is Boris Johnson speaking on the erasure of history. On the right-hand side, this is the response. We see how fears about ethnic minority bodies being rendered disposable was responded to instead. So on the one side, Boris Johnson is scared and wants protection for statues, and this is how he responds to Black and minority ethnic people dying. So Public Health England omitted the contributions of BAME voluntary and grassroots organisations in the final report. And I use BAME here to denote the way in which this was reported. However, I do recognise that the term can be harmful in the way that it homogenises diverse groups of people. So the General Secretary of the Muslim Council in Britain said, "It is therefore extremely concerning that the report published yesterday in Public Health England, whilst reiterating the racial and health inequalities intensify the risk of COVID-19, did not explicitly discuss the role of structural racism or include any recommendations as to how to tackle this and therefore prevent the unnecessary loss of lives." So here we have two different responses to lives being lost, or to statues, the government scream protection, and to people, they say, no, we will remove that. I hope that in this short talk you were able to see that our construction of race is social. This construct is impacted by historical, social and political contexts. By focusing solely on the biomedical, at the research and the clinical encounter, we obscure the myriad of factors that determine a person's health. As a result, the questions we ask at the research level and the interventions that emerge from it fail to capture the realities of so many people, and critically, people who are at the margins. So because of this, their voices and their lives are rendered disposable. And I'd like to leave you with a question. What can we do as healthcare practitioners to resist this?